These short stories based on actual events are taken from the books of Colonel John Henry Patterson, to which many people are unaware, and they have never been voiced to public. Even some events were not shot in the movie, Ghost and the Darkness, directed by Stephen Hopkins. I hope that my listeners will enjoy these untold true incidents. Before proceeding, it is requested that those who adore my efforts, please subscribe my YouTube channel, The Jungle Tales by Usman Ijaz, as a token of appreciation. Now let us come to the actual stories. In order to maintain sequence, I have divided today's story into chapters. Let's begin with Chapter 1, Death of a Workman by the Man Eaters of Tsavo. J. H. Patterson narrates, on the 10th of October 1907, I sailed out of Marseille harbor, bound once again for Mombasa, the picturesque gate of that land of sun and adventure, British East Africa. Within 3 weeks, we reached our destination and dropped anchor in the harbor of Kilindini of Mombasa. From this port I took train for Nairobi, the capital of the country, and at about midnight on the 1st of November 1907 I awoke from a restless slumber in a Uganda railway carriage, and found myself speeding down the incline which leads into the valley of the Tsavo, some 130 miles from the coast. It was with a feeling of returning to my own that I peered out of the carriage window on that starlit night, gazing into the gloomy depths of the thorny wilderness, which shuts in the iron at this part of the route. The unchangeable face of this expanse of sun-bleached recalled to my memory 1,000 incidents and adventures connected with the building of the railway, when it was an everyday occurrence for workmen to be seized and devoured by the 2 insatiable man-eating lions who at that time haunted these wilds. I have told the story of their depredations and final end in my book, The Man Eaters of Tsavo, but the details of many tragic deaths and narrow escapes remain still unrecorded, and some of these came crowding back to my mind with startling vividness as bit by bit the well-known route unfolded itself before my eyes. It was with a shudder that I recalled, in particular, the circumstances connected with the death of a workman who was seized and devoured near here by one of the brutes. A platelayer who witnessed the whole occurrence described it to me very realistically a few hours after it had happened, and it is as gruesome a story as any that has yet been told. The victim was an Indian coolie who happened to be one of a gang sent down from railhead to load up some building material, which was required for plate laying. At this particular time the man-eaters had not yet made the name of Tsavo so terrible and sinister in the ears of the workmen as it afterwards became, and they therefore lay down to sleep anywhere in the open quite fearlessly. One evening the unfortunate man whose end was so near went to rest, with some companions, in an empty truck, which was standing on a siding. There was not room in the truck for all the workers, so some of them slept on the top of a pile of wooden sleepers that had been made at the side of the line at this place, and among these was the platelayer who described the occurrence to me. He told me that as he lay awake in the waning moonlight he was startled by seeing a lion creep stealthily out of the undergrowth and stalk in silence towards the truck where his companions slept. He immediately shouted out, "Beware, brothers, a lion is coming," but on hearing the cry, the brute hid himself in the shadow with the agility and silence of a cat, and when the men craned their necks for a view of him, he was nowhere to be seen. There happened to be a goods train standing on the siding for the night, and the lion now ran down the full length of this under the wagons, and a few minutes later was seen staring with glowing eyes into the guard's van, in which at the time there lay, rolled up in a blanket, an engineer named Ogilvy who was an invalid on his way to the coast for change of air. Poor Ogilvy little dreamed of his peril that night. Undoubtedly the lion meant to have seized him, but just as the brute was, as the workman graphically described it, dancing on his legs, preparatory to a spring, a cleaner who was at work on the engine a little distance away threw some slag onto a heap of iron rails, and this so upset the lion that he dived under instead of into the van. Presently the watcher on the sleeper stack saw him come out from the shadow of the van, stand for a few seconds in the open track as if undecided what to do next, then disappear again beneath the train. He must have run along very quickly under the wagons, for a moment later he was seen standing beside the coolie's truck, and before the watcher had time to utter another warning cry, the lion gave a spring and landed in amongst the men. As may be imagined, the panic that ensued was indescribable. Shrieks, yells, and terrified cries broke the silence of the night, as the powerful brute closed his jaws through the shoulder of his victim, and, shaking him as a terrier would a rat, lifted him up and carried him off. Ogilvy's servant happened to be lying next to the man who was seized, and the lion, in springing up, landed with a paw on his shoulder, driving the claws well home. The poor fellow got a terrible fright, and, thinking no doubt that his end had come, added his cries to the general uproar, which made the jungle ring for miles around. The coolie who was lying on the other side of the victim felt his comrade's body being drawn across him, and tried to save him by seizing an ankle, to which he held on until he was forced to relinquish his hold when the brute leaped over the side with his prey. The platelayer told me that it was heartrending to hear the man's cries as he was dragged from the truck and through the jungle, nor did they cease until the crunching of his bones and the loud purring of the horrible brute, which could plainly be heard by the terrified men, proclaimed that at last his sufferings were at an end. I may mention that the engineer who had such a lucky escape on this occasion did not long survive, as he succumbed to his fever a short time afterwards in Mombasa Hospital, where Dr. Winston Waters and myself visited him and did our best to cheer him up a couple of hours before he died. Ogilvy was one of the best engineers on the railway and a right good fellow. Chapter 2, Narrow Escape of My Sikh Workman. On one occasion, some workmen of mine had a narrow escape at a camp near the Tsavo bridge. The occurrence took place at a time when the fear of the brutes had gripped hold of everybody, and the imaginative Hindu had already endowed the lions with supernatural powers. 5 Sikh carpenters had made a staging some 8 feet high and on this had pitched their tent, where they slept in peace, and, as they thought, in safety. Every night they gained access to their airy abode by means of a movable ladder, and they took the precaution, Robinson Crusoe-like, of pulling it up into their castle immediately after nightfall. I had already warned these men that their perch was not nearly high enough, and told them that they would be much safer on the water tank or in trees, until the iron huts which I was then building for their protection could be got ready. They did not wish to move, however, and Natha Singh, the leader of the party, assured me that they felt quite safe so high up. Besides, was not Kuda, the god, all-powerful? It seems that Kuda was indeed looking after them. One night, contrary to their usual custom, they carelessly left part of the ladder projecting a little way beyond the end of the staging. A hungry man-eater on the prowl observed this, and thinking that he could not find a meal more conveniently elsewhere, determined to try how a carpenter tasted. Calculating his spring, he leaped lightly onto the projecting ladder, which, unfortunately for him, instantly tipped up and toppled over, both falling heavily to the ground. No doubt the ladder gave him a good blow when it struck him, for he fled at once without attempting to touch the men, who, thoroughly terrified by the tearing of their tent caused by the tipping up of the ladder, and believing that the lion was upon him, jumped from the staging in all directions and with terror-stricken cries raced for their lives to the nearest trees. Fortunately no one was hurt, but after this the staging was deserted for the more secure fastness of the top of a masonry pier rising out of the riverbed. Those who don't know how these man-eating brutes met their fate, please write in comments. I will make an episode or 2 on how did I manage to kill them. Chapter 3, A Widow's Story. J. H. Patterson states that there were too many events occurred while his stay in Tsavo. When he used to recall them he trembled and felt pity. Here I want to narrate a widow's story from the book of the Man Eaters of Tsavo. Very shortly, before I left Tsavo I went, on March 11, 1899, on inspection duty to Voi, which, as I have already mentioned, is about 30 miles on the Mombasa side of Tsavo. At this time it was a miserable, swampy spot, where fever, guinea worm, and all kinds of horrible diseases were rampant. But this state of affairs has now been completely altered by drainage and by clearing away the jungle. Dr. Rose was in medical charge of the place at the time of my visit, and as it was the good old custom to put up with any friend one came across towards nightfall, I made him my host when my day's work was over. We spent a very pleasant evening together, and naturally discussed all the local news. Amongst other things, we chatted about the new road which was being constructed from Voi to a rather important missionary station called Taveta, near Mount Kilimanjaro, and Dr. Rose mentioned that Mr. O'Hara, the engineer in charge of the road making, with his wife and children, was encamped in the Wataita country, about 12 miles away from Voi. Early next morning I went out for a stroll with my shotgun, but had not gone far from the doctor's tent when I saw in the distance 4 Swahili carrying something, which looked like a stretcher along the newly made road. Fearing that some accident had happened, I went quickly to meet them and called out to ask what they were carrying. They shouted back, "Bwana, the master," and when I asked what Bwana, they replied, "Bwana O'Hara." On inquiring what exactly had happened, they told me that during the night, a lion had killed their master, and that his wife and children were following behind, along the road. At this, I directed the men to the hospital and told them where to find Dr. Rose, and without waiting to hear any further particulars hurried on as fast as possible to give what assistance I could to poor Mrs. O'Hara. Some considerable way back I met her toiling along with an infant in her arms, while a little child held onto her skirt, utterly tired out with the long walk. I helped her to finish the distance to the doctor's tent. She was so unstrung by her terrible night's experience and so exhausted by her trying march carrying the baby that she was scarcely able to speak. Dr. Rose at once did all he could both for her and for the children, the mother being given a sleeping draught and made comfortable in one of the tents. When she appeared again late in the afternoon, she was much refreshed, and was able to tell us the following dreadful story, which I shall give as nearly as possible in her own words. She said, "We were all asleep in the tent, my husband and I in one bed and my 2 children in another. The baby was feverish and restless, so I got up to give her something to drink, and as I was doing so, I heard what I thought was a lion walking round the tent. I at once woke my husband and told him I felt sure there was a lion about. He jumped up and went out, taking his gun with him. He looked round the outside of the tent, and spoke to the Swahili soldier who was on sentry by the campfire a little distance off. The soldier said he had seen nothing about except a donkey, so my husband came in again, telling me not to worry as it was only a donkey that I had heard. The night being very hot, my husband threw back the tent door and lay down again beside me. After a while, I dozed off, but was suddenly roused by a feeling as if the pillow were being pulled away from under my head. On looking round, I found that my husband was gone. I jumped up and called him loudly, but got no answer. Just then, I heard a noise among the boxes outside the door, so I rushed out and saw my poor husband lying between the boxes. I ran up to him and tried to lift him, but found I could not do so. I then called to the soldier to come and help me, but he refused, saying that there was a lion standing beside me. I looked up and saw the huge beast glowering at me, not more than 2 yards away. At this moment, the soldier fired his rifle, and this fortunately frightened the lion, for it at once jumped off into the bush. She added, all 4 soldiers then came forward and lifted my husband back onto the bed. He was quite dead. We hardly had back into the tent before the lion returned and prowled about in front of the door, showing every intention of springing in to recover his prey. The soldiers fired at him, but did no damage beyond frightening him away again for a moment or 2. He soon came back and continued to walk round the tent until daylight, growling and purring, and it was only by firing through the tent every now and then that we kept him out. At daybreak he disappeared and I had my husband's body carried here, while I followed with the children until I met you. Such was Mrs. O'Hara's pitiful story. The only comfort we could give her was to assure her that her husband had died instantly and without pain, for while she had been resting, Dr. Rose had made a post-mortem examination of the body and had come to this conclusion. He found that O'Hara had evidently been lying on his back at the time, and that the lion, seizing his head in its mouth, had closed its long tusks through his temples until they met again in the brain. We buried him before nightfall in a peaceful spot close by, the doctor reading the funeral service, while I assisted in lowering the rude coffin into the grave. It was the saddest scene imaginable. The weeping widow, the wondering faces of the children, the gathering gloom of the closing evening, the dusky forms of a few natives who had gathered round, all combined to make a most striking and solemn ending to a very terrible tragedy of real life. I am glad to say that within a few weeks' time the lion that was responsible for this tragedy was killed by a poisoned arrow, shot from a treetop by one of the Wataita people.